Hey everyone, welcome to the Script and Style Show, the web show where we talk about web development and the people that make it happen. I'm Todd Gardner from Track.js JavaScript Error Monitoring, and my co-host David Walsh, creator of the popular blog davidwalsh.name. How's it going, David?
Better than last week.
You were sick as a dog, huh?
I was not feeling good. Like Wednesday at maybe 2 o'clock, I was like, "Oh no!" You know that moment you know you're sick or you're going to be sick. Like when it
first coming on.
There's no way around it. It's going to happen. You're there. It was the worst.
Yeah, you got to clear your schedule for the next couple of days because you're like, "Oh, this is going to take me down. This isn't going to be good."
Oh, it did take me down. It was terrible. Now, are you somebody who gets sick often?
Not so much anymore. My kids have gotten a little bit older, so they're not the plague factories that they are when they're in preschool.
When you get sick, are you the type of person who's just like strong and goes about it? Or are you like the total baby who acts like they've just been hit by a sniper?
Well,
like, you can't do anything for yourself. Which are you?
I like to think that I'm strong about it, but I'm sure the rest of my family thinks I'm a big baby.
See, I'm a total baby too. I'm like, oh, Christina, can you get me water while I'm like right next to the fridge? Like, I'm the worst. I'm the worst. But you had a better time last week.
I did.
I saw on Twitter.
I did have a better week.
You need to tell me about this Jeep.
Yeah, so I was live tweeting a car buying experience over the past couple of weeks. My eldest daughter is going to be buying my car from me sometime this summer as soon as she saves up enough money. And so I needed to go buy a new car. And I've never really considered myself a Jeep person, but the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. And so went to car dealers and dealt with all of that BS and live tweeted the whole experience out on my Twitter about all the bullshit you have to go through with it. But it did end up landing a Jeep. They even threw in a couple of extra hats because they wouldn't, negotiate with me quite as far as I wanted. So this is a $300 hat, which I was trying to get it for $300 less, and they're like, "No, but we'll give you a hat."
Oh wow!
So this is my $300 Jeep hat. But I've had it for a couple of days now. Taking the top off it right as soon as I got it. It's pretty amazing. I'm big fan.
When we got our last car, I was like, "Oh, Christina, I want a Jeep. We need to get a Jeep." And her first inclination was to turn to me and go, "David, you're not 25 anymore." I was like, "That's savage, babe." And
harsh burn.
Like, she wants a convertible, but what I keep telling her is the angle of our driveway will never allow a convertible, right? It will scrape every time. But you get a Jeep, you take the top off, you get to have fun.
The thing about convertibles is they're either super low end or they're super high end. There's not a lot in the middle except a Jeep. And so if you can go out and buy yourself a BMW or a Mercedes like hardtop convertible, because we're in the north. It's kind of has to be a hard top. Yeah. Otherwise the winter's it's not going to be a good situation. And so there's just nothing that really plays. Like either you're getting a Miata, which is fine, but I would look ridiculous in a Miata. Or you have to spend, $60 grand to get a BMW or Mercedes. But that Jeep, it plays right there in that middle spot. It can be your convertible. You just have to take the top off yourself. There's no buttons to push.
Yeah, see, I'm not very handy, so I don't think I'd be good at that either. Anyways, let's get on to tech.
Let's move on to the real stuff. Okay, so our guest today is Mr. Max Lynch, the co-founder of Ionic and a fellow Northern Midwesterner. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
You forgot teammate of David Walsh in the Madison Soccer League?
Yeah. Premier League. Local Premier League of recreational old people.
I buried the lead, huh?
Yes.
Well, so before we get right into it, I just want to point out that if you have any questions that you'd like us to work in for Max or about Ionic, please put them in chat and we'll work them into our conversation. With that, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Max? Tell us a little bit about your story. How did you become a developer?
Sure. And let me know if I'm breaking up because I just noticed a few connection issues. My story, I've been a developer since I was pretty much in middle school, so like 13. And I got introduced to it through thankfully through a family friend who lent me his like Java 1.1 book. This was pre-Java 1.2, so it was pretty gnarly back then. And I tried
It's pretty gnarly now.
Yeah, it's still pretty gnarly, I think.
It depends on who you ask. It's getting better, but I agree. Yeah, and so I tried learning it back then. I couldn't really figure it out, and I took a little break and ended up picking up JavaScript a little bit afterwards, which made a lot more sense to me. And so pretty much I've been building, in the browser for a long time. I got went to UW-Madison here, got a CS degree, so I do a lot more than just web development these days, but that's always been kind of a common theme for me. Fast forward to post-college, my best friend Ben Sperry, started a company to basically try to help people build apps and websites much more easily. And that was kind of pretty quickly out of college, so I don't really have a lot of normal work experience. But yeah, that's what I've been doing for the last almost 5 years now, is running what became Ionic here in Madison.
Sorry, was taking a drink. That sounds that sounds great. So you never had to work for the man. You never secured like a corporate gig and pulled tickets and
I did a little bit. I did some internships in college, specifically at Northwestern Mutual out of Milwaukee, and then I worked at this really interesting kind of intern programming farm for Thomson West.
You worked for Maverick.
I did. You know about that? Yeah.
I went to Mankato where Maverick started.
Oh wow!
And then I worked for Thomson Reuters, and I worked with Maverick people.
Man, you went all the way. That was a good college job. I got to have really flexible schedule, and I was working on XSL though.
Oh no!
I will say that kind of doing XSL taught me to do functional programming and recursion a lot better. So it wasn't all bad. But yeah, that was my last real corporate-y type development job.
It's important to have that though. It grounds you in the reality of most developers and
it
real
breaks
pain.
you.
It breaks you.
Oh God.
What was the landscape of the web and mobile when you started Ionic?
So we started what became Ionic back in 2012, and we started as a company called Cordova, and this was a drag and drop designer tool for jQuery mobile. So that back in 2012, jQuery mobile was pretty much the top dog when it came to building things that looked like an app using web technology.
Right.
And so we built this designer tool. We were fortunate to get it promoted on the jQuery mobile homepage. So we ended up getting a decent amount of users, bootstrapped the company, basically selling monthly subscriptions to this. And then eventually we realized people were trying to build apps that rivaled what they saw in the App Store. And at the time, 2013, jQuery mobile just wasn't really that thing. It was decent at making mobile websites, and I think we've all used the jQuery mobile website for flight travel and stuff. But it wasn't going to get you something that felt like Facebook in the App Store. And so Ionic kind of came out of the idea that the phones had gotten a lot more powerful. This is around the iPhone 5. You could do fast transitions and fast animations, but things like jQuery mobile hadn't really given web developers those primitives, basically fast components that were optimized and didn't cause a bunch of layout thrashing in the browser, and could get 60 frames per second on modern phones. And so we tried to build Ionic around this bringing all those components to these new phones. So yeah, jQuery mobile is pretty much the state of the art when we got into this.
Okay. And then how did Ionic Framework come about, or where's Ionic Framework in the timeline?
Yeah, so Ionic Framework came about in 2013. So we were working on that product Cordova that I mentioned, and it was it was bankrolling us. So we were basically it was recurring revenue. So we didn't really have any like our time was not tied to the income basically, because we weren't a dev shop or anything. So fortunately, we were able to basically take a few months off from basically working on Codica completely. I don't know if our customers know that, but we took 3 months off, and we had been tossing around this idea of basically redoing jQuery mobile, and eventually it just there was this like culmination of a lot of things right at the end of 2013. Angular had been exploding. Like I think Angular 1.2 just came out, and it was really hitting like its hockey stick growth. Coupled with the phones getting better, coupled with us wanting to like do a more native feeling jQuery mobile, we ended up building a set of mobile components on top of Angular, and that community really was like it kind of took on a life of its own. Like that community really took it and ran with it, and kind of propelled it to where it is today.
Was Ionic open source then, and is it now?
Yeah. So yeah, there's a million details. I'm gonna gloss over here. Yeah. So we were a business, and we had kind of grandiose goals of what we wanted to do, and we felt like there was an opportunity to build this better framework, but also build a really interesting company in the process. And part of that was we felt like doing an open source project would be a way for us to get a ton of people using Ionic. And when we looked at kind of what was available around that time period, you had jQuery mobile, but then the only other like mobile option at the time was Sencha Touch, and their licensing was much more restrictive at the time. So if you were going to go and use it, like I think you had to pay them, or you had to use the GPL version, which Apple won't allow in the App Store, apps that are GPL licensed.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it pretty much taints everything that it touches. So they won't allow any of it. So we felt like, okay, we have nothing to lose, so let's just make this thing as free as possible, as open source as possible. We picked MIT license, which is pretty much as open source as you can get, and then release all these components for free. And with that usage, when we started getting some of the adoption going, we started to think about the business side, and like thinking about like, okay, there's all these things that we could offer these people who are now using these components. And so we started thinking ahead a little bit, and ended up raising some venture capital back in 2014, early 2014, to basically keep building these things out and just like working on them. And that had been the strategy for the last few years, is just building out this open source platform. And now we're finally getting to this like commercial platform on top of it to kind of complete the stack essentially. Okay,
great. So you mentioned, is Sencha still, who are your competitors now? And I guess how is Ionic framework different from what they offer?
So there's obviously, if you're in the space, there's a ton of different options today. So Sencha was one of our earlier competitors, and I guess they're still technically a competitor today, although I don't feel like they're really doing as much mobile. Xamarin is definitely one of our competitors, although Microsoft bought them, so I think some of that competitive energy has cooled off quite a bit, but they were one of our competitors. And then you've got things like, other mobile technologies like Flutter or React Native or NativeScript or Fuse, or there's a lot of different options out there. So we kind of sit, like how we compare to all those other things out there is like, we are web native. So we've always been 100% focused on web technologies. So we're not trying to let you use like native UI controls through JavaScript, like React Native and NativeScript. We are focused on using web standards. And that's always been something that you either love about Ionic or hate about Ionic. And what's interesting right now is, as you know, progressive web apps and web components and stuff are kind of taking off. And I think we feel a little bit of sense of validation that focusing on web technology is the right move, because we're one of the few options in the space right now that can take advantage of that. Like, you can't build PWAs with Xamarin, right? C# doesn't build PWAs. So,
Right.
so it's been something that's been like controversial, like hybrid apps and, you know, web technology on mobile, but it's something that we've always focused on, and I feel like it's starting to pay off in a big way.
Yeah, you bet on JavaScript and it's paying off. That's good. It's
Yeah,
interesting that you said that that the competitive energy from Xamarin cooled off when they were purchased by Microsoft. That like now they have all these resources and stuff behind them, but they're like, not a big deal anymore.
Well, I think Microsoft's strategy, as far as I can tell right now, is to court developers no matter what they're using, and so they make their money on the back end, like Azure and stuff like that. So whatever you use, as long as it connects with Microsoft services, they're fans of it. So you know, I think Xamarin was. And we know a lot of the Xamarin folks, and they're awesome. But you know, like, they were trying to build an independent company, and there's just a lot more competitive energy at that point.
Mm-hmm. So there's some commonality though, is that like what Microsoft's doing is they don't care what you use. They're trying to just, if you're in the ecosystem, they want to make money off of you using their backend services. But is that kind of similar to what you're trying to do with Ionic? Is you're created these set of open source tools, and then you want them to use your commercial backend offerings to help augment them and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it's more, I would say it's more similar to Xamarin pre-acquisition in the sense that we're trying to build this like really tightly integrated full stack offering. So if you come in and use our open source stuff, that's like the front door. So a lot of people are totally content only using that and never giving us any money, and that's fine. But we try to filter out the people who are building serious apps or lately kind of apps at really big companies, enterprise. And we've got all these other things that are going to be important for you if you're building those kinds of serious apps, like an authentication solution for like handling like Touch ID and Face ID automatically, so you don't have to think about it. We've got like a mobile DevOps service, which is this new industry category. And the basic idea is like managing like deployments of your app, doing CI builds, things like that. And so by focusing on one technology, we can just do a lot of really tight integration, which I think is going to be harder for someone like Microsoft because they are supporting so many things that it's hard to just pick one and say, we're going all in on this one technology.
Right. So like you're, in a way, you compete with like a lot of people just in a very, very tiny niche of like you specializing build tooling and deployment tooling and all of these things for Ionic mobile apps. Yep.
And sometimes we compete with the community too. Like that's an interesting thing that's happened. Like we've competed a little bit with some of Microsoft's stuff for Ionic. So it's always like, you know, do we do this and compete with a potential partner, or, you know, there's always like this kind of balancing act.
Yeah. So what are the limitations? So you positioned Ionic as it's fantastic for building a native mobile app. It's the series of tools and controls on top of the foundation that lets you go faster and you can leverage some of your services. What is it not good at? What are the limitations of Ionic? Where is maybe like a use case that doesn't apply for you?
Well, if you take a look at what an Ionic app is when it's in the App Store, technically you have access to everything. It's a native app. It is just doing a lot of work in that web view. So when you use our controls, you're really just building things in the web view. So there fundamentally is no limitation, but there's just a few things that we probably won't help you out with. Like we don't have a lot of, like we certainly don't do anything for games. We don't have a lot of 3D stuff. AR, VR, you're not really going to get anything out of it from us because we don't have like a cross-platform layer on top of iOS and Android. So if you're building that kind of thing, you could easily build like an AR experience in your Ionic app and then control it from the web view. But that's just not something that we're really going to specialize in. Inside that web view, you're kind of you're constrained by what the browser can do. So if you really want to do like a bunch of stuff in that WebView frame, like animations and things like that, you may or may not have some performance overhead to doing that. But really, I think a lot of our users think that the gap between native and the web has really, really gone away, and we agree with that, obviously, which is why we built this. So those are kind of the barriers, and in there, like, there's this whole category of apps that were really, really well suited for data-driven stuff, social network style stuff, things like that are kind of a great fit for Ionic. But AR, VR, 3D stuff, not really going to do much for you.
As a quick aside, what is the state of web views now? I remember, a handful of years ago, people felt like the web view was sort of being underpowered or underappreciated by the native OS companies because they didn't want to support web stuff. They wanted their native stuff.
That is, I think that's a dead problem. Apple has really upped their WebView support specifically. So, well, the thing about iOS and Apple is like they've always led on performance. Like they destroy Android and Google on WebView performance, and they always have. So their new WebView, WK WebView, is even better than what we used to have. It's got their just-in-time compiler, so it's super fast. Animations are good. So we're in a better place with that now. On Android, the story has been rocky, but now we have Chrome web views that are evergreen and they update. So it used to be that we had to support a whole bunch of old web views and things that were missing, like good APIs, like web animations and things like that. Pretty much, we had to make the decision to stop supporting certain versions below like 4.4, and soon we're going to cut it off at 5. Once you do that, you're kind of liberated to not have to worry about a lot of messy web view issues. So it's basically just as good as the latest Chrome on Android.
Awesome.
And Windows Phone? I'm just kidding. Nobody gives a shit about Windows.
You'd be surprised. We've got like a few. It seems to have like a foothold in certain European countries. And every time we talk about it, we joke about it. Someone will say like, "Well, not in Finland. We still have a lot of Windows."
I'm pretty sure we have somebody from one of those Norwegian countries hanging out in the chat room right now.
Let us know. Well, so with Windows, actually, we're excited about doing like two things. So like Windows has done a really good job supporting progressive web apps, and they actually have their like I forget what it's called. It's like a Windows JS library that you can use to like do more native stuff. So we're definitely going to support that. And then we're also supporting Electron. So if you want to build like an installable desktop thing, like you'll be able to target Windows. So the Windows platform is kind of almost like desktop on mobile. So it's a little different.
Does Ionic do anything for you in terms of like normalizing the UI patterns between these different platforms? Like, can I create a list control and it's just like it looks like a list control would natively look on these different platforms?
Yeah, so that's been a big part of what we've done since the beginning. Is you write with like one type of markup in one code base essentially, and then it maps the look based on the platform that you're on. So if you're the type of person who's like, I know Android's material design library through Java inside and out, Ionic's probably not a fit for you because you should just do what you already know. But if you're someone who's like, I know web technology, I want my app to look material design and look iOS, but I don't care about that specific super custom control on Android just for Android, then Ionic's probably going to be a good middle ground for you.
Okay, so let's say that I found that I want to use your framework. How do I get started? Like, how do I build an app today?
So you go to ionicframework.com, and we've got a quick start that basically has you install our CLI, and you can run one command, and you've got a new app generated on your computer.
Oh, nice. You mentioned that in the past you had a UI tool. Does that still exist?
Yeah, it does. So we had this product called Creator, which like we've got this legacy of building these like drag and drop visual design tools, and that's still out there and people are using it. They're paying for it. We're exploring kind of a new take on that, which is like almost like an IDE for Ionic development. We haven't really talked about it publicly at all, but I think I'm really, really excited about this project. It's something I've actually been working on almost 100% of my time. I'm excited about it because the next version of Ionic uses web components. And by using web components, we're able to build like a designer tool that not only is kind of like framework agnostic, so we can support projects that are built with Angular or React or whatever, and like the tool itself doesn't have to be implemented in React or Angular, it can be implemented in like a consistent, like abstract way. But also it's really easy to build reusable components. And that's something that like a lot of our enterprise customers have been asking for. Like they want to build one date picker and share that one date picker across a company because they're sick of building like 100 of them. Right. So web components have kind of like given us this chance to build like a really interesting tool that blends in like custom components, drag and drop, designer stuff in a way that I don't think was quite as possible before. So that's a newer project we've been working on.
Awesome. World exclusive there.
World exclusive.
You mentioned web components. And when you first told me that a few months ago, I was a little, I was sort of surprised, right? Because web components, we had, the last show we had Dylan on from Dojo, and they had this idea for web components a long time ago. Dylan and Alex Russell, and that's sort of where their UI framework came from. It took a long time for us to even get like a web component spec. And I remember when I first got to Mozilla 6 years ago, I was sort of contributing to a web component library called Xtags. And it just seems like web components, they just never took off like you thought they would. You know, like forever, we would complain that we had to build our own widgets, and it was like a div and a span and 8 more spans and a list and this and that, right? And you're like, finally, we have the power to do it, but it hasn't felt like they've really taken off. So why did you bet on web components? What brought you to that?
I mean, that's a good question, because back when we started Ionic, we picked Angular not because Ionic had to be built on Angular, but because there was no way to build reusable JavaScript components and distribute them. Like you had to have a framework host like Angular or React to essentially run those components. So even back then, like it wasn't something we were able to do. So fast forward to 2017, and 2017 was kind of a transition year in 2016 where like a lot of these new technologies like the web components V1 spec were like promised and just about to hit, but it was always like, you know, give it a few months or give it a year. Right. But in 2017, a few important things happened. First of all, iOS added support for custom elements natively. And that was a huge signal, I think, to everyone, like this isn't going to be just a Google thing. And actually, I think Firefox deserves a lot more credit for, and Mozilla deserves credit for starting it. But the people's attitude is like, this is only ever going to work in Chrome. No one else is going to support it, et cetera. So seeing Apple support it was a big signal that, okay, this is safe to like invest in. I think I like to give ourselves a little bit of credit for building out some tooling on top of web components. The problem with using web components today, if you're trying to support a lot of different devices, is you have to think about things like polyfills and browser support, but also like taking the way that you're used to building JavaScript apps like Webpack and lazy loading and all that stuff and bringing that to web components, like none of that has been easy. So this brings me to Stencil, which is a project that we built in 2017. We started it, and the idea with Stencil is it tries to take like Angular and React design patterns, but then generate web components. And along the way, it's doing things like automatically loading polyfills for browsers that need them. So you as a developer don't even have to think about it. If we detect like, oh, they're on IE11, it doesn't support custom elements, give them the polyfill file. And it's bigger and it's a little bit slower, but at least it works seamlessly.
Right.
We automatically load components together. So, hey, this component depends on this one and this one, so let's fetch them all in one request. Doing things like server-side rendering, like we'll render the components and rehydrate them when the browser connects. So there's a lot of these things that just had to fall into place. And I think, frankly, none of this was going to happen without like smaller development teams like Ionic, because someone like Facebook and React, like they've always been very public about not necessarily caring about web components. And I think that shows in the fact that React doesn't have good custom element support yet. So I think it just had to have these smaller companies and these libraries start to use it and start to like smooth out the rough edges. And I think today, like we're ready. Like we're going to see a lot of Ionic apps using web components. People might not even realize it. They'll still be using Angular and such. And I think that's how it's going to grow. It's kind of like a little more of a shadow thing.
What
No pun
was
intended.
what was like the what was the community reaction changing from Angular to web components?
So I think there's a few details here. So we started with Angular 1, and then we did a big rewrite in 2016 for Angular 2. And it was an incredible amount of work, and we basically told ourselves we never want to do that again. We never want to build a set of components that have to have framework X in order to run, because it's a moving target. We don't control that project. Like we love Angular, but like we don't control Angular. And so they'll make decisions that either make our lives harder because something broke or don't necessarily fit with our vision. At the same time, we want people to be able to use whatever they want. So when we started thinking about web components, it was driven by never having to have our users go through a painful rewrite ever again, but also just letting them use whatever they want, because like I think we thought Angular was going to win and dominate and be like the end of the story back in 2013. But as we all know, there's just so much diversity in frameworks today. People are using React and Angular and Vue. And if you ask developers of those frameworks, like they each think that it's going to be this is going to be the time that it endures. But that's not going to happen. And so we basically said, like, let's stop fighting that war. We really don't care. If you want to use Angular, cool. Let's focus on building a set of components that we can keep updated and maintained at our own pace, and also just focus on the components themselves, which is what we're best at, and they'll work in whatever you want to use. So at first, I think the community was like, oh God, is this like the third rewrite? But now they understand that we are trying to never do that again. And actually, if you were using Angular, the transition is really pretty minimal. It's basically like we're getting rid of a lot of custom Ionic Angular stuff and just using the official Angular CLI stuff. So people were scared, but I think they're really coming around.
So does this sign you up for building a bunch of glue code that takes the data from those web components and sticking it, like binding it up into new versions of Angular and new versions of React, or new Bob Jones framework X that is yet to drop, but is going to be the new hotness?
So yes and no. Angular like post 2.0 has really, really good web component support. So you can put in custom elements and treat them just like any other element, and Angular doesn't mess them up. It doesn't, like, there's no rendering issues. Like, it works perfectly. Go to React and it's a different story. So what we've done is because Stencil is like a compiler, and it's based on TypeScript toolchain. So we built your component. It's just a simple file. It's a TypeScript class. We're able to kind of statically analyze it and pull out all the types and things like that. We can generate like React bindings really easily. And we're actually doing this for Angular because it's just having like the actual component be an Angular component just has a few benefits that make it a little bit easier for people to consume. So in the same thing for React, like we can convert the custom element naming convention, which is like lowercase tag dash lowercase tag, to the one that React developers expect, which is like uppercase class name style. So having a compiler is a huge advantage for mapping between all those. And I hope it's a dying problem because, I hope React has better web component support someday. Vue.js plays pretty well with it already. So I think that it should be an obsolete problem soon.
Good, good. So it's a short-term headache, hopefully, for you.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
How does this work like on top of the native code? Do you have to like depend on Cordova, or do you have any like sort of interactions with those sort of apps?
So yeah, so this brings me to the other project we've been working on. We have a lot of projects. So Cordova is what we've used for shipping apps to the App Store since day one. And if for those who aren't familiar with Cordova, it's essentially a set of tools and a simple plugin library that turns JavaScript calls in a Webview into maps them to native calls. So it's really just a simple like proxy layer for building these plugins and exposing them to the Webview, and then tools for like building and running the app, like doing binary builds in Xcode and things like that. So we've used that since day one. We've actually been working on a new project called Capacitor, which is a kind of a fresh take on Cordova. So it is a library that helps you call essentially native style SDKs and sensors, like take a picture, and it maps that to native code when running natively, but like modern web APIs when running on the web. It's because now we have things like WebRTC and things like that, where we can actually stream a camera and take photos and provide like a mobile style experience in the browser. And that's something that Cordova has never really done. So for us, like we're able to give you that kind of like translation layer where your app will run on the web, it'll run on Electron, but also iOS and Android with the same code. And then Capacitor will like proxy that to the right place underneath.
Wow. So how far out is that? Or have you launched that? Where is that in the dev process?
Yeah, Capacitor's in alpha, so we've got people using it, people testing it. It's going to go into beta here pretty shortly. So that's a longer term project for us because Cordova works well for us, and it like we don't really feel the need to remove it anytime soon. We kind of like Electron was to Node WebKit. Like we've got a few different goals with the project. We've got a few different approaches that we're taking. And so slowly over time, we're going to incorporate that into the Ionic tool chain. So you'll be able to say, instead of Cordova for this app, I want to use Capacitor. And it's going to take some time to get people used to that. And you need plugins to work with it, although we've got Cordova plugin support for it. But yeah, it's a longer term effort, kind of rebuilding the engine of what an Ionic app is.
So is that going to be open source, and is it something that, is it its own separate entity, or is it only built for use with Ionic?
So it's built in a way that you could use it with anything. Like one of the cool things about Cordova is it gives you a blank web page, and then you can call native code underneath. So Capacitor is trying to just replace that concept. So we have people who aren't using Ionic who are interested in using Capacitor. So it's MIT licensed. It's totally open source. You just go to capacitor.ionicframework.com. And so yeah, so that's kind of the reason why we build these things and like brand them independently, is they really can exist on their own. But when you're in the Ionic experience, like we try to combine it into like one thing.
That makes sense.
So we had a listener question about security. What kind of security constraints or approach to security have you taken with Ionic to make sure that the apps that people are building don't have any vulnerabilities, or you protect against the most common ones?
That's a good question. So I think because you're in the browser environment, you've got that class of browser security concerns like cross-site scripting. Cross-site request forgery I don't really think applies as much, but if you're using, like there's a lot of ways to shoot yourself in the foot in the browser. Like, oh, I'm going to evaluate this random code I got from untrusted client. Like, just like don't do that kind of stuff, and 99% of your problems go away. That's the benefit of using like Angular or React on top of it, is you get a lot of that sanitization for free. because those frameworks are very security focused. So I would just think about making sure that your framework or your libraries that you're using are secure, and then you'll be secure. On top of that, we are there's this whole category of like security problems that happen when you're not using native SDKs correctly. So one thing we've been working on right now is like I mentioned, a reusable authentication system, because we kept realizing that people were using like biometrics like Touch ID and Face ID incorrectly, and they were like not using the keychain for storing tokens and encrypted tokens properly. So if you aren't really familiar with how all those native pieces work, it is possible to build a situation where things aren't working correctly. But that's the same issue if you're doing a full-blown native app too. So
another question that I just thought of, at Mozilla, of course, I work on the DevTools debugger. What is the debugging experience when creating an Ionic app?
So both Chrome and Safari have a remote debugger. So you basically can open up Chrome and go to like inspect devices, and then if you're testing Android, it'll show right up, and you can connect to it and have like a full-blown Chrome debugging experience. And then Safari for connecting to a connected device or a simulator. So it's pretty much just like debugging any other web app.
Awesome. You have to realize I'm still slightly jaded from the early days where we were trying to like shim anything to get debugging in an iPhone to work, for example.
Yeah, it's come a long ways for sure.
Awesome.
We have another viewer question that just popped in. Is Ionic more for enterprise apps or private apps? Maybe can you clarify, what do you mean by private apps while Max starts to address it?
So yes, and I mean yes to all those things, whatever it is. So we see pretty much every type of app being built with Ionic. So we've got some people who are building typical consumer apps for the App Store, like social networks, like Untapped, which is a beer rating app. It's built with Ionic, and then we've got some bigger companies who have built their flagship apps. We've got a few that are coming really soon, which I can't talk about quite yet, but we've got that category of app. And then we've got, we're starting to see, and this is the thing I'm most excited about from the business standpoint, we're starting to see companies just getting into mobile right now. Like we all think like, okay, mobile's kind of like, it's run its course. It's what, like 10 years now, we're used to it, right? But enterprise companies and big companies have been outsourcing mobile development for a long time and are just starting to realize like, oh, we could do this stuff internally. Like it used to be, oh, we're going to have that one, like our customer app is going to be in the App Store and they're going to need a bunch of native developers to build that. So let's just go hire a dev shop to build it out and we're not going to worry about it. Today, we've got some well-known retail companies in your backyard, Todd, that are building a lot of apps for like every line of their business and doing it with internal teams. And these are team web developers. Like they don't have native development experience. They don't know all the concepts in mobile. They don't know Objective-C or Swift, et cetera. So we're doing really well there. And actually, I think that type of app is really also well aligned for building a business in mobile, because it's hard to build business on consumer apps because how many apps are people downloading, right? On the consumer side, we've got Facebook, and the long tail it's really hard to build a successful consumer mobile app. But the enterprise doesn't really have that problem. They have a different type of problem that is good for people trying to build a business.
Yeah, they're not trying to make money off of you buying their app. They're trying to make money off of making the app lets them make money off you faster in other ways that you were already interacting with them. Like it makes you buy more from them or whatever.
Yeah, and even just like tracking inventory in one of their stores, like an employee is going to use. It's a different type of problem they're trying to solve.
Awesome. One question that also came up: how has your team grown over time?
Yeah, so we're a little over 30 people now. We've got most people here in Madison. We've got a few people. We're trying to be a little more remote friendly, so we've got probably 8 people remote, and then we've got a cluster of people in Boston. So yeah, the team, started here in Madison, and was small for a while, and then we raised some venture capital over the years. So we did like 3 different financing rounds, and the last round we did was in 2016, and that's when about a year after that we went from about like 15 people to 30. So it's a good number. It's been like an interesting experience because I've never employed this many people before or managed this many people. But thankfully we've got a really great team to kind of take a lot of that burden off my shoulders specifically.
Awesome. That's a good problem to have. Big team, lots of excitement around your product.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey for sure. So, we're trying to, like, as a company, we're trying to just make sure we don't make the same mistake that a lot of these like venture-backed startups do, which is they just blow through all their cash and run out of money without building a real business. So we've been really focused on trying to get to essentially like a sustainable break-even point, and not try to just bank on raising that next round of funding and build something that's going to last. There's been a lot of change in like the startup ecosystem that we're kind of following, and just trying to not be reckless about it. And because things take time to build, they really do. They always take longer than you think. And it's a tragedy how many companies kind of like burn out before they really like give themselves a chance. So trying to not fall into that.
The slow SaaS ramp of death there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that is it for us today. As our tradition, let's close this up by kind of going around and talking about like one big takeaway, one point that we talked about today that each of us are going to take away from the conversation. Why don't we start with you, David? What was your big takeaway from the day?
My big takeaway is that I'm super excited that web components, someone's made a big bet on them. That makes me incredibly happy because I've loved them for a long time, but felt like I was the only one that loved them. So it's good. It's good to see that they've been adopted, of course, by all of the browser vendors, but also by a big framework big mobile framework, I should say, like Ionic. That's really cool.
Awesome. I have kind of a similar thing. I really like that Ionic, that you guys bet on the web. That, like, 4 years ago, it wasn't obvious, right? Like, there was a lot of interest in native mobile stuff, and there was a lot of debate about whether or not it was good. But you followed the path of always betting on the web, and it's paying off. And I think that's fantastic. I think that's the future. I'll give you the last word. What's your big point that you'd like to leave us with?
I should buy a Jeep.
Yeah, you should. I was looking. There's a lot of fun trails between here and Madison. We could go and go off road. Well,
the thing that I always find funny with like David randomly living like a few blocks away from me, and there's like all these things that I grew up knowing about. Grew up in this space, like X tags. Like, I knew about all that stuff years ago, and so it's kind of just weird that like someone who worked on it is basically in my backyard.
Maybe that's why it never succeeded, is because I was working on it.
It was before its time, man.
It was.
Well, awesome. I think that's great. Anything else you want to plug, Max, before we close her up?
No, if you want to check out Ionic, go to ionicframework.com.
Absolutely. That sounds great. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. I think this was a great show. Next week, we'll be back with something else that we have yet to decide. If you have any ideas, feel free to shoot them to us on Twitter. I'm at Todd H. Gardner, and my co-host,
David Walsh blog.
Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.